What you're watching was the planning stage of the build. My original idea was I'd show you how I work things out and how I make my builds, but it was hours long, and honestly, a lot of this changed once I hit maps. I got to work on a ranger since I had a very specific want for this character. They have to deal either lightning or ice damage to stack the heralds, something I'll explain later. They need as much movement speed as possible, and they need to attack from range. The last one is just because I personally like playing ranged characters in ARPGs. For that reason, I settled on Deadeye. This is not a build guide, by the way, not even close. This is all really, really rough. I'm still trying to figure everything out. Sometimes we feel incredibly tanky, and sometimes we just get one-shotted. It's my first time playing an evasion build in POE2, though I reckon there's probably more defense nodes I need to pick up to fix this. Either way, while I'm figuring things out, I thought I'd give you all a sneak peek on something that's kind of the complete opposite of the sniper build. We're fast and we have great clear, but our single target is bad. So bad that during the campaign I had to actually level nodes to increase damage against rares and uniques. But once we got into cruel, we melted the bosses. We just don't melt the map bosses on all high tier maps. The other big difference is the summoner is very much a budget build. 3, maybe 4 divines and you should be clearing T16s without a problem. I do not even want to go into how much I've spent on this new character. The basic idea is we run a lightning or ice skill that has loads of added damage from our gear for both cold and lightning. Then, thanks to this, we can proc Herald of Thunder and Herald of Ice. These two heralds are what actually clears the map for us, especially Herald of Ice, as when it procs you destroy a frozen enemy and it detonates the air around for big damage, whereas Herald of Thunder procs on killing a shocked enemy and strikes lightning on targets around a dead mob. The weird part is though, we actually want to lower the damage of both of our heralds to infuse the opposite type of damage. This is because Herald of Ice cannot freeze and Herald of Thunder cannot shock, but Herald of Ice can shock and Herald of Thunder can freeze. So by using support gems to introduce the opposite types of damage and more support gems to increase the freeze and shock chance of these heralds, you create this loop in a sense, where the heralds are proccing each other and blowing up the whole screen, and sometimes even mobs off screen. If I'm being honest, I thought this build would be super easy to figure out, put the pieces together and get running. But I've had a lot of issues trying to figure out how all this works. We were proccing Herald of Thunder constantly, but not Herald of Ice. So I swapped from Lightning Arrow to Ice Shot to help the freeze build up, and it still wasn't quite enough. So I did some googling, and eventually I stumbled across DS Lily's build for her Pathfinder that seemingly uses mana flasks to throw an ice grenade. Honestly, it looks super fun, super cool and really unique, but it's too late. I'm already a Deadeye and I'm settled on this idea. At the bottom of the build is a sort of troubleshooting section, where she says if you're not proccing the heralds, you need some more flat cold and flat lightning damage on your rings. So I grabbed some rings that give a lot of added cold and a lot of lightning damage, and of course we're running Ingenuity, so now we're getting an extra 74% on top of this. So now, 90% of the time, we just obliterate the entire screen. But sometimes we just have these moments where we deal very little damage, and I imagine it's something I'm just missing. I haven't invested in any accuracy. I've got high enough dex that the tooltip says I have 100% accuracy, so I don't know if I do need accuracy or not. Like I said, this is far from a build guide. I'm still figuring things out, and I'm hoping by putting this out there, maybe one or two of you can give me some tips. Minions are simple to figure out. If it says minions gain X stats, that's good, we want that. But now I'm trying to balance max life, evasion rating, energy shield, while stacking dex and int and crit. It's really, really hard to balance all of this out. As I said earlier, this version is not very budget. I've stolen my ingenuity from my witch to level this character up, and it felt so good I've just kept it on it. When I first wrote this script, I wrote that I've had 2 divines dropped. Well, since then I've had another 8 divines dropped, and several divines in just gear dropping as well. I don't know if GGG changed something in this patch, but for some reason my character is lucky, and I am just getting loot dropped like crazy. So with the first 2 divines, I actually decided to buy myself a new pair of gloves. These gloves are unique, that come from the Breach Pinnacle boss, which I've personally not seen yet. But despite the trade site making it look like they cost 1 divine, I spent almost an hour messaging people until finally somebody replied when I got down to 2 divines. And he replied by saying 2 div and 70x. It's a slight con if you ask me to do it like this, but I spent so long, I just decided to do the trade. You know, the craziest thing about PO2's trading and the way that the website is implemented into the game works really well. If someone wants to buy an item off you, it highlights the item and tells you which one it is. It works really, really well, which is crazy because if you've managed to make this system and you've got a currency exchange system, which I also think is really, really good, why not just have an in-game trading system like an auction house? At the moment, I tend to find that the website is just absolutely rife with scammers and 90 to 99% of sellers just don't reply. Since those gloves, my quiver has cost me 1 divine, my chest and helmet are close to a divine each, my rings are okay, but I really want to replace them with breach rings, but all the ones that I see on a trading site have had their attack modifier quality increased to 50%, and when I tried that, it did not increase the damage of my lightning or cold, so I use lightning or cold specific modifiers on my rings. That way I can also try get high added cold damage with cold resistance, and likewise a high added lightning damage with lightning resistance ring. This should make it a lot easier to get res capped, and maybe then I can start focusing on the chaos res, which is still at 0%. The rest of my gear is mostly odd bits and pieces, but I have now just replaced my bow with another 1 divine. Now you might be looking at this and seeing it's a Widow Hail and going, I've got one of those, it's not worth a divine, it's worth a couple of X. Widow Hail can roll up to 250% increased effective on the quivers, but if you corrupt it, it can go past that. But the second you corrupt it and go past that, the price skyrockets. So for this I paid 1 divine to reach at least 270%, because that way you can combine it with the +2 projectile levels on your quiver, and you actually get an extra 9 levels in total from this. I love with this character using Lightning Arrow, but we swapped to Ice Shot in maps to try help with that initial freeze build up. I'm changing the supports I'm using on this constantly. Right now I am running Martial Tempo, Primal Armament, Cold Penetration, Cold Mastery, and Ice Bite, and so far this has given me the most effective clear. I would have thought Fork would be really good for this, and I was running that pretty much the entire early maps. But once I started to get to the higher tier maps, I needed more initial damage, and since the Heralds are blowing up the screen anyway, I decided to drop Fork, and it's felt really good since then. I have tried things like, obviously, Fork, I've tried Heft, Close Combat, Ambush, all sorts. Otherwise, on Herald of Thunder, I'm running Cold Infusion, Glaciation, Long Shot, and I swap between Nerve, Ice Bite, and Cold Exposure. I don't know which is most important, but if we crit, then the cold exposure is probably going to help with any pen issues we might have. Long Shot I thought might be good for hitting the mobs off screen. On Herald of Ice it's basically the same story, just with the other element. We're using Lightning Infusion, Conduction, Magnified Effect because the cold is doing the big explosions, and here I also swap between a Nerve, Ice Bite or Overcharge. For the majority of mapping we'll be shooting our Ice Shot, and we don't need to use any other skills, but for now I do have really bad single target. So for this, I drop Orb of Storms on the target's head, and I spam Lightning Rod on top of it, which is actually a lot more effective than I thought it'd be. I use a very low level Voltec mark, and the reason for this is because I want to use it to keep my Ascendancy passive stacks up in between packs, as it gives us skill speed, evasion, and movement speed. And apparently here I forgot to write in the name of this passive. What we're building up is something called Tailwind, but don't worry, I do go into it a bit more later on. On Lightning Rod, I'm using Scattershot to drop 3 of these on each cast, Concentrated Effect for more damage, as the area of effect doesn't matter since we're only using it for single target. And lastly, I'm running Persistence right now, just so it lasts longer, but now we're out of campaign, I don't really think that's needed, so I need to revisit this skill. On Orb of Storms, I'm running Chain, Overabundance, and Unleash. So we actually drop multiple of these orbs on our target for amazing damage, and then Chain is actually for the bolt that Orb of Storm shoots off whenever we use a lightning skill near it. For Voltaic Mark, I use Considered Casting and Arcane Tempo, just so we can cast it as fast as possible to build up those stacks. And of course we are running Grim Feast. Even though we don't have a very big energy shield right now, that is something I want to improve on this build. All of the energy shield is basically coming from one item, which is our helmet. There's a little bit here and there in my gear, but we are absolutely evasion stacking. But I'll explain that in the passive tree section later on. I stick Clarity on Grim Feast, aim with our mana regen. Lastly, I'm using Wind Dancer to stack up evasion rating, which works perfectly alongside Tailwind from our Ascendancy nodes. The passive tree looks like a mess, and at first I was terrified to show it, but like I said, I have now looked at some similar builds, and there are quite a few similarities, and I did actually just straight up copy a few parts from DS Lily's build. It was just better, okay? I'll be honest, it was just better. For example, I wasn't thinking about picking up the node's Subterfuge Mask, but it's a ridiculously good node, and I can't believe I wasn't planning on picking it up. Likewise for Spectral Ward, giving us Energy Shield based on our chest evasion, which for us is at 1600. I won't go into every node in detail or how to path, since some of this is bound to change over the next few days. Essentially though, I am stacking movement speed, projectile damage and speed, bonuses gained from equipped quiver, evasion rating, crit, and little bits of lightning and cold damage here and there. We do run acrobatics to let us evade all hits, and once my buffs have stacked up, we sit around close to 10k evasion despite acrobatics. We do want passives relating to heralds, so I run Coming Calamity, and in my necklace I anoint Doomsayer. For duels there are so many options. Added damage with bows, projectile damage, elemental damage, cold damage, lightning damage, crit chance, crit damage. You get the point. But to solve mana issues, all we need is one duel, actually I'm running 2 now, that gives 2% mana back on kill. Sometimes we need to flask, but that's absolutely fine, so long as we don't have to use it more often than we can fill it back up, which is exactly the problem I ran into with the gas arrow skeletal archer build at first. Lastly, we are trying our best to int stack to get all that added damage from our gloves. The dex is also useful, but I just want to reach 205 so we can get our level 20 gems. As for Ascendancy passives, the first one I picked up was Point Blank. Since more often than not the mob's going to be right in your face and on top of you, I figured it'd be better to do more damage close than further away. And this is even more so in breaches, which is the main reason I made this character. Then I grabbed the extra projectile passive, Endless Munitions, before finally grabbing Gathering Winds and Wind Ward for the Tailwind buff. What Tailwind does is every time you use a skill, you gain a stack that lasts for 10 seconds. It increases our movement speed, our skill speed, and evasion rating. This is why I run a super cheap skill with a very short cast time to spam in between packs of mobs. Tailwind can also be lost if you get hit, but Wind Ward makes it so we take 3% less damage per stack, and I'm never below 10 stacks, so 30% less damage. All in all, we're pretty tanky, but sometimes you get unlucky and evasion fails several times in a row, and you just die. But to be completely honest, I think that's just me. I think I've still got a lot of work to do on this, and it's probably a skill issue. What I will say though is my minion build can shove any map into the atlas and run it. There is not a single modifier it has a problem with, except for maybe burning ground, and that build is super cheap. You can get to T16 maps, I reckon, on about 3, maybe 4 divine. And this build, like I said earlier, is not cheap. But I would argue this build has a much higher damage ceiling than the minion build, and the clear speed of minions is never going to reach the speed of this build. Which is why for closing thoughts, I really wanted to emphasize that it's a very good idea for you to pick a build and stick with it, take it to endgame, and start farming the currencies, start farming all these uniques that can improve your leveling process. And it doesn't need to be my build, pick any build, just get yourself to endgame. Once you start earning currency and you get that stockpile uniques, your leveling is going to be a lot quicker, you'll have a ton of T3 support gems and jeweler's orbs, so you can start a character, instantly give yourself 3, 4, 5 sockets if you're absolutely confident you're going to play this character a lot, stick some tier 3 supports on it, and you will just one-shot the entire campaign. And by playing different characters, you learn all sorts about them. What items do they need? What substats are important? It gives you a better understanding of the market, which those of you in the trade realm really do need to take advantage of. But this is coming from an MMO player that could never stick to one character. I just love the different playstyles in RPGs, whether it's summoning an undead horde or blowing up the screen with ice and lightning arrows, swing a giant hammer or casting spells from a wand. I just love ARPGs, and I want to try everything. I am not finished playing on a necromancer. I am the kind of player that likes to go back and forth between my different characters, and I like to give them different roles. This character is terrible at bossing, the necromancer is fantastic at bossing. The necromancer is okay at clearing maps, this is brilliant at clearing maps. So with that, I want to say thank you all for watching, thank you very much for listening, thank you for 2,300 subscribers, it really does mean a lot. I know I'm horribly behind on comments, I'm very, very sorry about that, and I haven't put out a post since like 1,700 subscribers, so I am really, really behind on all of this. I am very sorry, but thank you everybody for everything. And I'll see you all again really, really soon. Bye bye.